Stage 6, I'm calling authority. And I see a kind of evolution happening in Jesus' life during stage 5, which was mission, a kind of evolution into a sort of deeper sense of authority, where you're even beginning to wonder, who's really speaking here? Because early on, Jesus is inhabiting some well-known roles, even archetypal energies like prophet. People knew what prophets were. Rabbis, people knew what rabbis were. And healers, people were familiar with healers, both Jewish healers and Greek healers. So those were not new. Now, the way Jesus embodied them, I think, was unique. But something else begins to emerge during the course of Jesus' life, which I'm calling authority, or a deeper authority, and ultimately is going to seal the deal when it comes to the end of his life. Like, if he continues to speak out of this place, from this kind of inner authority, he's going to end up being killed. And so I want to talk a bit about authority. And first of all, let me read a passage, and then I'm going to mention some things about Ken Wilber, and then I'll try to make a few comments. So let me find this. This is the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is worth reading in and of itself, especially if you want to understand how Jesus described the kingdom he was talking about. So that's in Matthew. So the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, it says this: "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law," which is very interesting. So we have to make a few guesses, and I'm using scholarship here, but what does it mean that the teachers of the law did not have authority? And probably the simplest way of explaining is that the teachers of the law were responsible for repeating the law, and they were responsible for repeating the acceptable teachings and interpretations of the law. That's how you became a teacher of the law. Here it is, and I learned from my teacher, and my teacher learned from his teacher, and so forth, in a kind of lineage. And that has a place, of course, but they're repeating, in a way, the status quo. But I don't mean that negatively, but I mean the common acceptable interpretations for how to keep the Torah. Torah means a teaching, not necessarily law, but how to keep the teachings of the Jewish people. And every culture, every spirituality, every religion, I think even every contemporary expression of quote spirituality needs some kind of Torah, some kind of law, some kind of guide. And you might think, no, wrong. My friend owned a vegan restaurant, and the employees at the restaurant and the cooks at the restaurant were all vegans, and trust me, they had a Torah. They had a law, and they were just as fundamentalist about it as any other fundamentalist I ever met. You know, one time I was keeping bees at the time, and I brought in some honey, and the chef wouldn't even touch the jar of honey because of the abuse that I had put the bees under. You know, trying to tame this wild creature and then using it, you know, for my own whatever tastes, which was funny because they also made tons of things out of cashews, and on these cashews come from massive farms in California, and none of these massive farms in California would be operative without bees and without the manufacturing, in a way, of bees and bee colonies, which I know it has all kinds of environmental. None of this is morally neutral. But my main point was, hey, you need a Torah. You need a Torah. You need some kind of structure. And I think that's why many people are having such a hard time growing up. I think that's why parents are having such a hard time raising kids, especially if they're kind of in a post-Christian world, or maybe that's not even the language they would say, but post-evangelical for sure, because a lot of my friends are evangelicals or post-evangelicals. And it's like, yeah, now I don't know what to tell my kids, you know. The law seems so heavy-handed, but now it doesn't feel quite right to just say, do whatever you want. You know, no, because human beings need borders. They need boundaries. They need guardrails. And the Torah is very much like that. So the teachers of the law were repeating how to keep it, worth knowing. And that's hard-earned, by the way, that kind of interpretation. It's not random. It's hard-earned. It's wisdom over time. But Jesus is not that kind of teacher. And right here in the middle of his ministry, something else begins to emerge. And people are saying, wait a minute, he's not sounding like the teachers of the law. Wait a minute, he's not sounding like other rabbis I know, at least not too many of them. He's not even sounding like just repeating phrases from the prophets. And here's the line that gives us a clue. He says, you have heard it said, but I tell you. You have heard it said, do not commit murder. I tell you, do not get angry. Now, that is one who has authority. And it's very nuanced here, which is why I want to mention something that I got from Ken Wilber. So Ken Wilber talks about the evolution of consciousness in about 27 different ways. But one of them kind of sounds like this, that you have a kind of pre-conventional stage of consciousness, you have a conventional stage of consciousness, and then you have a post-conventional stage of consciousness, or a more integral stage, we could say. And it's a little more nuanced than that, but I just want to use the three here. So pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And in pre-conventional consciousness, it tends to be pretty narcissistic and can sound like, no one can tell me what to do. I'm my own authority. I don't need your laws, rules, insights. I don't need your religion. I don't need anybody. I can figure this out on my own. Pre-conventional. I'm not doing what the man tells me. Pre-conventional. And then you have, actually, it's an evolution of consciousness into the conventional, because the conventional stage of consciousness realizes that if everybody behaved in a pre-conventional way, no one could tell me what to do, and F you, then the world would be a mess. And how could you have society? And how could you have trustworthy economic interactions? How could you even have a family? How could you educate kids? How could you walk down the street safely? So conventional thinking comes along, like something like the Ten Commandments, and says, hey, here are the basics. Don't murder people. Don't be envious. Keep the Sabbath. Don't curse God. Whatever, the Ten Commandments. I don't want to list them all. But those are hard-earned, because what is society without? Let's take murder, for example. What's a society like that says, nobody can tell me what to do, and if I want to take your life, big effing deal, I'll kill you. That's a world no one wants to live in. So it's an evolution of consciousness to have some conventional thinking. The problem with conventional thinking, of course, is that it tends to be very rigid. And it tends to say, it's always been this way, and it doesn't need examination, it doesn't need clarification. We simply need to keep repeating the status quo again and again and again and again so that society doesn't unravel. Now, the next evolution of consciousness inside this kind of three-tiered thing is post-conventional, or integral post-conventional, something like that. And post-conventional is very interesting, because post-conventional consciousness sees the point of the rules and understands the point of the rules and understands that society can't live without rules. But it also has enough awareness that there are times when those rules can be broken. There are times when those rules don't apply. There are times when you might adhere to a deeper kind of rule or intuition or authority than what conventional wisdom or conventional laws or conventional whatever have to say. That's post-conventional. Now, here's the trick. Many people confuse, this is straight from Ken Wilber, post-conventional thinking with pre-conventional thinking. And actually what's happening when most people say that no one can tell me what to do, and I don't need these rules, and I'm above these things, even if they're not saying it, that directly, oftentimes, according to Ken Wilber, they're regressing into pre-conventional thinking, not moving forward into post-conventional. That's able to hold some paradox, that's able to see the good. Like, here's a line from the Dalai Lama. You have to know the rules well so you will know how to break them properly. That's integral post-conventional consciousness. It sees it sees the importance of convention, and knows very subtly that they don't always apply, and there's even a time to break them. But it requires a sort of deep wisdom, and I would also add a kind of inner authority to know when those moments are. Now, Jesus appears on the scene, and he begins over time, as he begins to live out his mission in life, as one who has authority. He begins to, and think how subtle that is. You've heard it said, but I tell you. He doesn't say, you've heard it said, don't commit murder. Now, that's a bunch of BS. I don't know what Moses was thinking. And he's so, uptight, relax, man. And no, you've heard it said, don't commit murder, but I tell you, do not get angry. So Jesus wants to speak about the deeper level. He wants to, in this particular case, he wants to have a conversation about where does murder come from, which is a whole lot more interesting. Because how do you succeed in keeping the commandment, do not commit murder? Well, you don't commit murder. You don't go kill someone. Therefore, I did it. All set. Good. But Jesus wants people to grow beyond that. So he says, okay, let's talk about anger. Let's talk about the roots of where these things come from. And that's much of the Sermon on the Mount, dealing with very unsavory topics like murder and anger and lust and even religious expectations like tithing, giving a portion of your possessions over to the temple, or fasting and prayer. He picks on all these things. He picks on almost every element of convention you can think of inside Judaism. Or Judaism wasn't one thing in the first century. It was nuanced, but nevertheless, he's having that conversation, but he's coming from a place of authority. You've heard it said, but I tell you. Now, what gives him the right to say, but I tell you? That's the question of authority, and that's the question of stage 6. And at this point, it might be difficult if you're a Christian, you're coming from a more I was going to say orthodox, but I don't even know what we mean by these things anymore. But traditional Christian beliefs, we say, well, Jesus has authority because he's, the Son of God, and I don't have that kind of authority. He wrote the book, therefore he can rewrite the book. And to me, that's a cop-out. I think that's too easy of an explanation. How can Jesus speak like this? What's he tapping into? And what might that say about our own transformation? Our own life transformed as we potentially and possibly move through these stages and are invited to move through these stages, or even the mystery begins to move us through these stages. You've heard it said, but I tell you. Now, before I say a little bit more about that, I think there's something interesting about this phrase. So right now, we live in a highly privatized spiritual environment, and I mean that across the board. If you're an evangelical Christian, a Catholic, Orthodox, Buddhist, non-religious, a nun, atheist, agnostic, a Hindu, a Wiccan, a Celt, a shaman, whatever, a pagan, whatever you are. It's a pretty privatized world. You can get away with, probably for the first time in human history, saying, well, I'm a neo-Celtic pagan Christian, and nobody's going to challenge you on that. It's actually amazing. It's like, what is going on? There is a lot of freedom to move between ideas and camps, and let me say something positive about that. Some of that has come from the work of scholars in comparative religion, saying, hey, a lot of religions are pointing to some similar patterns. And you might not feel quite at home in the pattern you were raised in, but there might be one just right next door that maybe rings your bell a little more. So amazing. Now, the privatization, though, of all things, is having the effect, in my opinion, of dumbing down religion. In fact, religion itself, people mock as if it's just tribal, backwoods, uneducated, lower level consciousness. And there's a sense of just, if we could just get rid of the whole thing, everyone would be okay. And what's slipping through our fingers is the first half of what Jesus said, which is you've heard it said. Right now, we're entering a world, or have already entered a world, where we simply don't know what it says. We haven't heard. We haven't heard from the elders. We haven't heard from sacred texts. We haven't heard from the Bible. We haven't heard from Jesus. We haven't heard from Muhammad. We haven't heard from Native American elders. We just haven't. We haven't heard it said. Yet we're still coming forward and saying, but I tell you. No one can tell me what to do. I've got my own private religion. No one can challenge it. I don't care when I don't even know. I'm rejecting Christianity. I don't know what it says. I don't need to know what it says because I'm my own authority. That is what I'm going to suggest. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Maybe I'm not. Is pre-conventional. That's regressive. That's not, in my opinion, an example of a post-conventional, integral way of being in the world, because integral is exactly what it sounds like. The capacity to integrate. So if one cannot integrate the wisdom of the past, the teachings of the past, even if they're going to offer a different interpretation, it's not really post-conventional. If they're not able to integrate these things, if it's simply rejection, it's probably more regression than anything else. So I think I'm saying that just to warn myself, just because I will from time to time say things like, but I tell you, you've heard it said, but I tell you, or let me use a concrete example. I don't really agree with Paul on what he says about slaves obey your masters. I disagree. But the warning to me is not, it is something like this. Listen to him anyway. Listen to him. Try to find out what else he is about. Where is he coming from? What wisdom is being said, even if I'm going to say, and I reject that. I do not agree with such a thing. But I tell you, in other words. The challenge is to be integrative like Jesus is. And in fact, at one point, he even says in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, don't think I came to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. I mean, the only reason why he would have to say, don't think I came to abolish the law, is that's what people thought he was doing. He's throwing the whole thing out. He's saying, no, I'm fulfilling it. I'm interpreting it. I'm working with it. I'm embracing it and offering fresh, authoritative teachings that are rising up in me and through me in the moment. That's authority. Carl Jung would call this individuation, if you want a contemporary depth psychology word. Individuation, becoming an individual. Somehow living long enough and doing enough work where you're not just repeating patterns. You're not just attacked by your own complexes. You're not just fulfilling the conventions of your parents and grandparents and pastors and teachers and mentors or public figures or politicians or educators or whatever. You're not just punching the conventional clock, but you somehow are able to see the wisdom of convention and not speak like that and not live like that. Have enough autonomy to move to the side and live differently. That's, again, a line from Richard Rohr likes to say. Move to the side and live differently. That's autonomy. That's individuation. And that's what Jesus begins to uncover. And before we go too far, let me say it again. These 7 patterns that I'm pointing to here are patterns of a life transformed that are coming out of the symbolic Christ, and they're symbols of our own psycho-spiritual transformation. You too can touch upon the kind of authority. It's possible to rise up from within and to integrate the wisdom of the past and not just to regress into pre-conventional, nobody can tell me what to do, I'm my own religion kind of island thing. But to speak from that deeper level. See, here is something that is absolutely crazy about Christianity. Christianity, in its symbolic wisdom, came up with the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I say came up with, you could say, whatever. This is one way of putting it. But what's interesting about the Spirit is the wind. And the wind No one can tell where the wind comes from or where it's going. That's Jesus. No one can tell where the Spirit comes from or where it is going. And Christianity has always maintained that to be the case, that the Spirit, the animating, lively, creative expression of God, never, ever ceases. Always bringing order out of chaos and meaning out of chaos and newness and insight and freshness. And it's always, always evolving. And that means religion cannot fix it at any time. So you're going to come across teachers that say, you've heard it said, but I tell you, all of a sudden Martin Luther King popped into my head, The conventional wisdom was slaves obey your masters. And he said, you've heard it said, but I tell you. No. There's deeper truth. Now, in part, he was getting that from the prophetic tradition of the Bible itself, but also from the depths of his own being. You might say, what gives you the right to say something like that? Which is what the establishment is always going to say to people who begin to live and move and have their being with this kind of authority. There's a reason why Paul, too, was killed. There's a reason why not even the disciples seem to like Paul, because he's trusting in the nature of his own mysterious experience with this guy he never met named Jesus. And he's speaking on that level, and he's saying unbelievable things like, the Christ I'm coming to meet, there's no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. Christ is in all and is all. He's speaking as a mystic. That's that kind of authority I'm talking about. It's the authority of one's own inner experience and a kind of trust in that. Okay, let me give you one other way of thinking about this kind of inner authority and its ultimate source. So the Greeks talk about the muse, or really 7 muses, born from the river of memory in the underworld. And the muses are the mysterious, feminine, divine-like whispers that come from the deepest sources of who we are. They're the sources of inspiration. They're the source of all the arts. Music and art and poetry and dance and, you fill in the blank for art forms. And what's interesting, and I think this is sort of just commonly accepted wisdom, is there's a kind of mystery around creativity. Where does this come from? Who is the one speaking? And so when I say authority, I don't just mean the inner I, like as if it's just a glorified ego. Well, I tell you. It's actually, I think, something like a combination of I'm speaking from this deep source, and this deep source somehow transcends the I. It's connected to the deeper mysteries, is connected to the fountain of creative life itself, or to use Christian language, the Spirit. The Spirit is speaking, and I am speaking. You've heard it said, but I tell you. That I there's a blurring of the lines. And I think that the ancient notion of muses ought to be kept alive, because when everything is spoon-fed and so much of our culture right now is bowing down at the altar of science, and I'm a huge fan of science, obviously, and research, but we tend to think about science as something very rigid, like, oh, those are the facts. But any scientist will tell you they're in an ongoing conversation, even with the muse. Like Einstein said, he thought of E equals MC squared first in his imagination, and then he went forth and did the math. That's the muse. Where did that come from? That came from, you've heard it said, but I tell you. That inner source of authority, of individuation, of I'm coming from this place, and this place is being fed by the river of deep memory, by these feminine-like whispers that come up from the underworld, the muses, whispering their secrets, So now let's talk about where this might be taking Jesus, because the notion of authority, and especially if you're in a religious context, is going to get you into trouble. Anytime you're going to speak on this level, you're bound to experience some resistance. And I think there are some hints here. So first, I want to talk about this famous confession of Peter. So Jesus brings the disciples up to this place called Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them, who do people say that I am? And they're basically like, well, people think you're a prophet. And he's like, now what about you? And Peter kind of, in his dramatic way, says, you're the Messiah. And all Messiah means is anointed one. And he means it in kind of the archetypal prophetic image of, you're the one who the prophets were talking about, that's going to bring redemption and salvation and turn people back toward the ways of the divine. And you're the Messiah. You're the anointed one. The king who doesn't need an ordinary crown, we could say. And Jesus says, you're right, Peter, but flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. So that's that blurring of the eye. That's Peter coming into contact with his own autonomy. He's saying out loud, I think you're the Messiah. And also it seems to be a kind of whisper from the deep regions, from the Spirit. And in a way, it's giving you a clue about where authority is going in a life transformed. It's not going to be fixed just with the person of Jesus, for that's what Jesus turns around and says. He says, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, Peter. And on this church, or on this rock, I will build my church. And have a whole debate about what Jesus means, but on this rock, I will build my church. In other words, you have a role here, Peter. You go be this in the world. You go speak like this in the world. I'm going to die soon, which is what he begins to reveal to his disciples only at this point. As Peter begins to uncover a bit of his own autonomy, a bit of his own individuation, a bit of his own authority, Jesus says, okay, now I see where this is going. And Jesus says, from that time on, he began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Yeah. So authority is just not, hey, I'm going to give you these clever new teachings. Like, I want to talk to you about anger instead of just murder. Back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus sees that if he's going to live his life like this, he's going to come into a deadly conflict with the political and religious establishment. Because the political and religious establishment, in other words, ideology itself, on the right or the left, cannot tolerate this kind of autonomy, cannot tolerate this kind of integral way of speaking in the world. It has to get rid of it, scapegoat it, threaten it, destroy it, murder it, eliminate it, cancel it, whatever, get rid of it. And Jesus can see now, all right, I see where this is going. And he, at this point, starts to turn, Caesarea Philippi, starts to turn south geographically and walk all the way down the length of the Jordan River, all the way to the Dead Sea, take a right at the city of Jericho, and make his way up to Jerusalem, where he will meet his end. And I used to think that, Jesus was was the Son of God, so he just knew everything that was going to happen. I don't have that kind of view of sort of, I don't know what you would call it, Jesus's omnipotence or something. I see this as a very concrete and very human intuition about what's ultimately true. If I'm going to live and speak from this kind of place, from a deep sense of authority, and at times say, you've heard it said, but I tell you, and I'm going to take that all the way to Jerusalem, it's not going to end well. And he can see it coming. Which leads me to the final sort of passage here I want to pick up on from this stage. So Jesus eventually enters Jerusalem and goes to the temple. And this is in all four Gospels, so you can say almost with certainty this happened. And if I can speak as a historian for a moment, what I'm about to read to you is the reason why Jesus was crucified. from kind of a concrete historical perspective. Had he not done this, he probably wouldn't have raised enough eyebrows to get him killed. Here's what happens. Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. And he causes this giant ruckus up on the Temple Mount, disturbing the economic basis and challenging the authority systems. And he does this publicly, he does this intentionally. In a way, you could say the symbol here is he is destroying the temple itself. About 50 years before the temple is destroyed by the Romans, he's symbolically destroying it, saying, this is a house of robbers, of thieves. It's supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, is how that passage ends in Isaiah. But you're making it for the elite or whatever. We don't exactly know. He doesn't spell it all out, but it's the public act. And you have to ask, who is speaking here? And I would say the one who is speaking with authority. The one who's listening to the Spirit, to the Muse. And the moment is ripe. In some ways, I wonder if Jesus even pre-planned this. It would be nice to think, I was going up to Jerusalem and he's got this great plan for, symbolically destroying the temple. But I wonder if it wasn't just a more spontaneous moment in his life where that inner authority rose up, faced with the external realities of what the religious establishment had become, and it was just ripe. It was just like, there it is. There's the moment. And he said yes to it. That's coming from the place of authority. It's wildly risky. It requires a tremendous amount of trust. And in Jesus' case, it didn't end, well, you could say it didn't end well, but it cost him his life. And at this point, the temple authorities turn on him. And they say, enough is enough. He's going to start a riot here. People are going to like this, and they do. And so they hunt him down, and they arrest him at night, and they put him under a kind of fake trial. They hand him over to Caesar, claim he's a kind of religious zealot, claiming to be a king, and forces Rome to play their hand, that's what they do to people who claim to be kings under the kingship of Caesar. They kill them, they crucify them, they put them outside the city gate to be mocked and spit upon, and like a giant poster that says, you mess with Rome, this is what will happen to you. And I think in a way Jesus knows all this. I mean, maybe not in a way that, if then, but I think he has to know they're going to hunt him down, but he doesn't care. He's coming from that deeper place. It's not a place of convention. It's not a place of pre-conventional thinking. He's not like, nobody can tell me what to do, and I'm just going to, I'm going to build my own temple, man. No, it's not convention. Hey, you've heard it said, and we should stick to that. Or quoting the prophets and then calming everybody down and saying, hey, if we can just kind of put things no, he destroys the place. He throws things around. In the Gospel of John, it says he whips people. He makes a cord, and starts whipping and driving out the money changers. Like he's some sort of anti-shepherd, but he does it from this post-conventional place, a place of integration. He's saying, and how do we know that? Because he's saying, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations. You're missing the forest for the trees. You haven't got to the root of what the divine seems to want to do in the world, which is bring people under one house of unity, not a series of divided houses and us versus them. And he's willing to do this in the most public and central place in Judaism, right in the heart of the temple, right during the most important festival of the entire year, which is Passover. So, when it comes to uncovering, recovering, tapping into that deeper sense of authority, I guess I just hear a kind of warning in here. Yep, all right. It's risky business to be like this and speak like this in the world. But it's also not 100% reliant on the inner I. I tell you There's something mysterious happening here at this point, where the spirit, the wind, the muse, consciousness, if you prefer that, the wisdom of the evolution of consciousness, it's like tapping something larger than conventional wisdom, deeper than conventional wisdom that wants to bring forth something good in the world. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. But right now, this political, religious establishment is it's filled with robbers and thieves. Which brings me sort of to some questions about authority. Question number one, which I think is a question of our age. Are you really at a pre-conventional place, calling it enlightenment? I'm talking to myself. Am I really at a pre-conventional place, calling it enlightenment? Meaning, no one can tell me what to do. I'm just free, and I don't need any structures. I don't need any authorities. I don't need any wisdom. I am an island unto myself. And maybe if you're in that kind of place, if you're honest, and actually, the religion of one's own that you've created is pretty narcissistic. If you're honest enough to say that, maybe the step is something like, might I need the wisdom traditions right now? Might I need might I need some guardrails? Might I need, you've heard it said? Well, what has been said? What are our ancestors saying to us right now that need not be thrown out like what's that cliche? The baby with the bathwater. Yeah. It takes a certain kind of humility to admit, actually, I just don't want to be challenged. I want to remain kind of narcissistic, self-centered, navel-gazing, spiritual person. To say, I want to let that go. A certain kind of humility is needed for such a thing. Like the Dalai Lama says, you have to learn the rules well so you'll know how to break them properly. Maybe, if you're honest, you're actually in a place where it's time to learn the rules well. Not a place of breaking yet. Or maybe you're in question number two, maybe are you in a conventional spot? Have you been bowing down at the altar of convention? Your church, your denomination, your institution, your education system, your socioeconomic class, your ideology, your family history, whatever. I don't know. We all have a half a dozen of these. And convention is powerful. It's powerful in part because it works. It helps put, a border around a culture. But some part of you now recognizes that's not the language I'm speaking. That's not really the inner language that's happening. That's not really the nature of my deepest experiences. What would it look like to begin to trust that? And maybe you're in a place of even repentance where, man, I have been bowing down at the altar of the status quo, and I've hurt people because of it. I've hurt myself and others. And it's time for me to repent, to turn around, not even knowing where I'm going. Because this kind of like status quo, handed down authority isn't working. It's not really working. Question number 3. What is the true self whispering down there? What would it look like to really listen to your longings and desires and intuitions? What's whispering? You might be shouting about something on Facebook, but meanwhile, the still small voice within is whispering something that's very different. What would it look like to begin to listen to that? Because I don't think Jesus can stand up and say, you've heard it said, but I tell you, without this kind of listening. How would he know? Unless he's, to quote the Gospels, up all night in prayer. Kind of self-examination and wondering and curiosity. What's true? What's true? What's really true here? A kind of listening posture for the subtleties of one's own depths. What would it look like to trust these insights, even if they take you to scary places? And if they take you to scary places, rest assured, that's what the model of Jesus' life is showing you. This is what happens. It takes you to scary places. And maybe here's my final question along the lines of authority. What's your relationship like with the muse, with imagination, with the spontaneous, creative upwellings of the soul? What's your relationship like with it? Or do you shut it down? Do you make sure that every single moment of your day is activated by someone else, by something else, by some external stimulant? Because if you fill up your entire life, I can guarantee you, if you fill up your entire life with this kind of noise, I can guarantee you, you will not hear the muse. The muse doesn't scream. The muse whispers. The muse is in the underworld. The muse bubbles up. And we need this now more than ever. You could ask the same question using a different word. What's your relationship like with the Spirit? With the unfolding wisdom of consciousness? With the evolution of consciousness that may want to take us one step further? Another mini ego death and another mini submission into the animating spirit of God himself or herself. And what would it look like to turn your attention to this and to trust, to open oneself up to these kinds of musings in order to bring them forth? You've heard it said, but I tell you. Stage 7. Finally. Stage 7 in a life transformed. These 7 stages that I've been trying to describe as a life transformed. The transformed life of Jesus. And more than that, a kind of 7-staged symbol for our own transformation, for the way things are. And stage 7 brings us to the life-death-life cycle, the life-death-life cycle, or death and resurrection itself, which sits at the very core, at the very center of the Christ symbol. One can't even in our sacrilegious stripping away of all institutions and our skepticism around religion, religious institutions, religious people, we still we still know that Christ has something to do with death and resurrection. That you can't even think about Jesus without the cross. The word Christ and cross are holding hands. You could say for better or worse. We could say in a cheap sense or in a rich sense. And that's just the thing with symbol. Symbols have no bottom, as I said before. They transcend even our own ego's capacity to understand them. In fact, our ego in many respects is paralyzed in the face of the richest symbols, like the life-death-life cycle, like death and resurrection, like the title of this audiobook, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed, Jesus says. I tell you the truth, unless a grain of wheat dies and falls to the ground, it remains a single seed. But if it goes into the ground, it produces a rich harvest. And Jesus is saying, not only is this true of my life, this is an image at the very center of who I am. It's at the very center of my own story in a particular place, in a particular world, in a particular country, at a particular time period. Kind of the miracle of incarnation at that particular time and place. He's saying, this is my life. It is a grain of seed. And I'm telling you, if it goes into the ground and dies, then the possibility of fruitfulness is born. Not only is that true of my life, that's just true. He's saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? If you cling to it, like Jesus says, anyone who wants to save his life will lose it. That clingy, grippy, egoic persona that says, I must hold on to who I think I am. He says that kind of energy, you'll end up losing your life. You'll end up missing the point. But if you let go and you sink into the source and you descend beneath the ego and its demands and the personas that you've tried to promote into the underworld, into the ground of your own being and into the ground of being, period, with a capital B, into the source, the abyss out of which my life dimly emanates, to quote Teilhard de Chardin. Then you're tasting what's really real. And to sink like this is to experience a kind of death. It's to go into the ground. It's to plant the seed into the ground and see what happens. To die before we die. To live in such a way that who we think we are is sacrificed to a greater mystery. That's at the very heart of the Christ symbol here, of the life, death, life, of stage 7 here, which in some ways encapsulates and is the culmination of this life transform. This is the aim, the direction, those initial callings. Maybe just Jesus couldn't even see where these initial callings were going. Like he says to Peter, when you're young, you went around and did whatever you wanted, but when you're old, you'll be led by a way you know nothing about. That's my translation of the end of the Gospel of John. Yeah, when you're young, you think you know. But as life transforms you, as mystery transforms you, as you cooperate, which I think you can, with the transformative cycle here, with the life, death, life cycle, you're led. You're led by a way you know very little about, or you know nothing about, or you cannot fully see. And that's to let go and to allow who you are to go into the ground, to bear fruit. It's to live a life no longer oriented around my narcissistic and egotistical desires, or the flip side of that, my nihilistic, narcissistic, egoic desires. Nihilism meaning, well, there's no meaning, period. There's no God. There's no truth, and I might as well eat, drink, and be merry. A kind of giving up, which is just as narcissistic as saying, no, actually, I know, I possess, I'm in possession of the truth as it is. These are the traps. This is the cul-de-sac, what Ken Wilber calls the cul-de-sac of contemporary life, narcissism and nihilism. And the way out, symbolically, is to die. Is to die to this kind of clinging, and to sink, to go into the ground. And more than that, I want to say one more thing about the seed image, because it's speaking about your life, it's speaking about life, it's speaking about who you think you are. It's also speaking a bit about what we might even call our own gifts. Because if you've been tracking so far, to go on this sort of 7-stage journey, to be a part of it, to participate, to be in conversation with it, maybe is the best way to say it. Particularly in the wilderness and in these crucial transformative rites of passage and ordeals that we all undergo, the wilderness of our lives, we do touch upon that gift-wound dynamic. Yes, we touch our wounds, and somehow, strangely, our wounds give us clues about our own gifts. It's like even something about Jesus' own wounds makes him particularly attentive to certain kinds of people, and namely in the Gospels, the outsiders. What the Hebrew Bible calls the poor, the widow, the alien, and the foreigner. You know, the leper and the prostitute and the disenfranchised. He has a particular ear for this, which tells you something about his own wounds. And to dive into this territory, in other words, gives you a sense of your own gifts. And the same applies with this life, death, life image here. The life, death, life cycle, the death and resurrection. If you cling to it and never put it in the ground, so to speak, it never grows. If you never embody the gifts that you're given, they just die on the vine. And I hate to say it, but you know people in your own life who didn't really live life to the fullest, as Jesus promised. I have come that they may have life and have life to the fullest. But they held back. They held on to something. Maybe it was their fears or their own images of who they thought they ought to be. Who knows? 1,000 different reasons. But they never put that seed in the ground. It never had a chance to grow. They recognized a bit of their own gift wound dynamic, but they put it on a shelf. They put it to the side. Maybe they didn't feel worthy enough to put that out in the world. But Jesus is saying, if you hold on to your own life, like if you put your own life on the shelf like this, and never risk the possibility of death and of putting it in the ground, you'll never reap the benefits. There'll never be a resurrection. There'll never be a harvest, to use the same imagery here. So the life, death, life cycle, I'm sorry, like Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this is the way it is. We die before we die. To grow up, to be transformed, even to be enlightened, is to lose our life. And in the process be transformed into a harvest and into a full life that we only barely even have an imagination for. I mean, think about the life of Jesus. I mean, let's take out of it the sort of theological conclusions we make about Jesus. Well, he's, you might say, well, he's the Son of God. Of course, he's going to have an influence in the world. Let's just take that out. Let's just call him a transformed human being. The way he lived and the way he died was a seed that went into the ground that affected not just the next 7 generations, as the Native Americans say, but from the time the spear was run through his side on the cross to the present moment, his life and the symbol of his life continues to have a profound ripple effect throughout the entire cosmos, we could say. It's possible to live like that. That's what Jesus is saying. Come follow me is no joke here. It's not, hey, I'll do it for you, and then you can worship me and put up pretty pictures of me. No, it's, you can go through this. It is possible to live your life oriented toward the next 7 generations, to the next 77 generations. Every single thing you do and say and be can be oriented around giving your life away to something bigger. It's possible. Now, are we all going to do it, and are we all going to do it all the time? No. But to hold out the possibility, see, that's what I think the Christ symbol shines in on us here in the 21st century. And there's something about the global climate right now with COVID-19 and our economic crises and our racial crises and our socioeconomic crises, and probably the biggest one of all, the global climate crisis that screams out in a tiny whisper, die. Die to the way you've seen the world. Die to it. Die to what you're clinging on to, what your ideology and your belief systems and even your religion. And I'm getting ahead of myself. And even God, let it go. Let it die. so that something greater can be born, so that you can be transformed in the process, so that you can be like the blind people in the Gospels who see. See, it's so funny because the blind see Jesus and the seeing are blind. And that's what Jesus is inviting us into. Have the scales fall. And the only way to do that is to go through a kind of egoic death. Some of it we choose and some of it we don't. It's almost as if life gives us an ongoing opportunity. Every divorce, every job loss, every brand new love, like you fall in love again, every child born, every perhaps even every sort of random book someone suggests that somehow also rings your bell. It's like there are opportunities at every moment because life breaks us down naturally. And through our longings and our desires and our disappointments and our hopes, it's like life will do it to you. Perhaps that's why Carl Jung called it the second half of life, because it's like enough time has to pass. And that's why I wanted to talk about all 7 stages here. Enough time has to pass for us to be broken down enough to really descend, to sink back into the source of everything. That's a Rilke line. And to go into the ground and to await. David Whyte has this lovely line in his poem, What to Remember When Waking. He says, what shape waits in the seed of you? What shape waits in the seed of you? I love this. What shape waits in the seed of you? Because there's a seed of you, and within that seed there's a certain shape, a certain aim, a certain direction, a certain calling, a certain way of being in the world. What shape waits in the seed of you to grow and spread its branches against a future sky? To grow and spread its branches against a future sky. That's that life-death life cycle. In front of us is a future sky. Some of it we see now as possibility, and the branches of which go out and extend beyond our own mortality. Every single human being on earth is like a tree. And how you live your life, something will grow in its wake. And it could be nothing but a sapling, mowed down in the next storm. Or it could be a magnificent tree that beyond our wildest imagination brings shade to future generations. And to live with that kind of aim, that kind of purpose, is to grow into the elder, the archetype of the elder, which every single person is called to grow up, to pass through these 7 stages, and to give their life away, which is at the very heart of the life-death life cycle here. To live in with a sacrificial posture toward the community and toward the earth. I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life away, says Jesus. And you can't just do that, out of sheer egoic willpower. It won't work. You have to really die. And you have to have lived some life here to begin to orient your life around this. So I want to read a couple of passages that I think are examples of the life-death life cycle here, the death and resurrection symbol at the very heart of the Christ symbol. And the first comes from the garden scene just before Jesus is arrested. Pretty well-known passage. Let me find it. So this is, I'm reading from the Gospel of Luke here. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." And an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is kind of an anti-anointing scene. After all, the word Messiah means anointed one, and here Jesus is not being anointed with oil like some sort of king, but in anguish with his own blood, which is a little foreshadowing of what's to come here. So here Jesus finds himself alone in a garden at night, in anguish, saying, "Hey, if there's another way." And we could say he knows what's going to happen because he knows what's going to happen. He might not know the specifics, but the bow has been drawn and the arrow has already slipped from the fingers of the archer, and it's flying in a certain direction. And he's not going to get out of it. The way he has lived his life and healed people and taught and preached and challenged the religious establishment and had compassion on those who the culture did not deem worthy, set him on a collision course with his own religion, and larger than that, with the political establishment of Rome. And the arrow is moving forward. And so he's saying in such a genuine way, "Hey, can this cup pass from me? Do I have to drink this cup?" And I love it because prayer like this is so honest, and the response is silence. That's what it feels like in the garden, to lay out just your raw longings and desires to the universe, to God, saying, "I see where this is going and I don't like it. Do I have to drink this cup? Can it pass? Can it go to someone else? Am I really to carry this?" What amazing authenticity here Jesus is embodying. And then he concludes that thought, sort of like saying, "I don't want this to happen," with one of the more famous lines in the entire Gospels, "Not my will, but yours." And will can be a kind of confusing word to people, because I suppose you can imagine a very mechanistic God, as if he's a giant puppeteer up there, and he's pulling the strings, and everything is carefully orchestrated and pre-planned. And I don't think it's necessary to go down that road at all. But just to say, maybe there's a mystery at work larger than my own will, larger than my own ego, larger than my own capacity to see what's going on. And I'm willing to submit to this. I don't like it, but I'm willing to. Not my will, but yours. That kind of surrender seems to be at the very core of the life-death-life stage, of the life-death-life cycle, of the secret to the grain of wheat going into the ground. It's a kind of surrender. And if you're familiar with other religions, I mean, the very notion of surrender or other spiritual paths is central to many religions. I mean, in fact, that's actually what Islam means, which is something like surrender. So this is a letting go of the ego's claim on how things need to be. And it's in that kind of openness that the seed goes into the ground. The seed that is your life goes into the ground, and the shape waiting in the seed of you begins to grow and spread its branches against a future sky. It's a kind of submission. The 12-step people know what I'm talking about. It's a non-negotiable early part of the 12-step process, to surrender to a higher power. And I know that makes some people uncomfortable. It's amazing to me that atheists and agnostics still benefit from the 12-step process. I know it's a surrender to God or a higher power as you would understand him or her, which is a great, I think, broad way of including more and more people in it. But the truth is that you can't move on without this kind of ego death. And it's a way of saying, I think ultimately I'm not in control. I have a will and a desire, and I'm even expressing it. I don't want it to go this way. Can this cup pass from me? So it's not backing off of stating your longings. In fact, it's much more like getting in touch with them. And that's on the one hand. Maybe that's the left hand. And the right hand is, I'm not in control here. Maybe there's a mystery at work that's greater than my capacity to see it. And what if I lived with the paradox and the tension of desiring it to go one way and letting go of that desire? Do you see how different that is than, well, I desire it to go this way, I'm going to manifest it, and I'm going to make it happen. Or the opposite, which is, well, I shouldn't have any desires, and it's all about God's will, or it's all about the mysteries, and I'm just at the mercy of the winds of fate and change. It's neither of those extremes. It's right in the middle, which brings us right to the heart of the paradox of the life, life cycle. Death, resurrection, both. To hold the paradox here is the invitation of stage 7. I'm not in control. My life is not about me. It's not ultimately about me. I want to give my life as a ransom for many, to quote another line from Jesus. And it's a recognition, I think, of mortality itself. I think to really move close to the life cycle here, you have to get close to your own fears of death, to cozy up to them, to cozy up to your own impermanence. I love the, basic Buddhist tenet. Everything is impermanent. Or to quote the book of Genesis, from dust you came and to dust you shall return. Nobody gets out of this alive. Nobody gets out of this alive. Nobody survives the mystery of their own impending death. Jung says, life is a luminous pause between two great mysteries, meaning birth and death. And maybe early in life, it seems a bit morbid to dwell on these, but I think as we grow, the question of our own mortality, we have to get close to. Like Jesus explaining to his disciples, I know you think I'm the Messiah and everything, but I'm going to Jerusalem and I can see where this is going to end, and it's going to end in death. And there's a kind of terrible freedom that comes with this sort of recognition. Not my will, but yours. I know I'm going to die, so I want to die in service of the greater mystery. I want to die with the shape that's waiting in the seed of me, beginning to grow and spread its branches against a future sky. I want to die having tried to bring forth the aim and direction of my own soul, the image I was born with, to bring that forth in the world. Not my will, but yours. It's happening here in the garden. And moments later, he's arrested and betrayed by his friend and handed over to the authorities and taken through a kind of illegal trial, kind of a behind the scenes at night trial, and then handed over to the Romans. So the next, I think, passage that's worth just wrestling with a bit here happens while Jesus is on the cross itself. And let me find the line. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And first of all, we can say these are some pretty haunting lines. And he's quoting from a psalm here, which is interesting in and of itself. It's like it's connecting Jesus to his own ancestral tradition here, to the Psalms, to the very language of prayer itself that the Jewish people imagined over hundreds of years. And it's such a stark admission here. Why have you forsaken me? It's not, are you forsaking me, like a question. It's a statement of fact. You have turned your back on me. And the relentless march of history and fate is following its course, and nothing will stop it. And I feel totally abandoned and forsaken here. And it's amazing, I think, first of all, that Jesus has the courage to say such a thing, to express that. It gives you a little clue about the gift of, I suppose you could even call it Jewish consciousness, which still survives to this day. I know from my time living in Israel, where to argue with God and to lay your case out is terrible and beautiful at the same time, and totally allowed. What's his name? What is his name? I'm going to find it. Hold on. Elie Wiesel. That's the word I was looking for. Who wrote? He was a Holocaust survivor and wrote the book Night, and many other books and plays. And in one play, a town in Eastern Europe puts God on trial using the Talmud, like a rabbinic Talmudic trial, and God loses. That's the kind of consciousness that is allowed in Judaism. And that's the kind of religious posture, maybe that's a better way of saying it, that's allowed. And here Jesus is embodying that. State your case. And say, there are times when it's not only allowed, but appropriate and right to say, you've turned your back on us. Divine mystery. You've broken your own promises to protect and care for your children. After all, I am your son, to go back to the original insight coming up out of the water. This is my son whom I love. Where is that now? Jesus is saying. Where did that go? And there's something so dark about, and darkness is over the land. There's something so dark and human and true and real about what's happening here. One part of us knows exactly what Jesus is talking about. It's just not typically allowed to surface. And I think the life-death-life cycle, the symbol here, says go ahead and let it out. Because where is God? God is the great mute here. God is the silent one. Or, I don't know, you could even quote Nietzsche here, that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. That's that line from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Who will wipe the blood off of us? He follows that line up. And I think Nietzsche is right. To a certain extent, we have killed God as we've known God up to this point. And we are in a brave new world. I think when I first started feeling the urge to leave evangelical Christianity as a pastor, and a question that wouldn't leave me alone, I guess it's more of a statement, was we don't know what we mean by God anymore. And here I am every week giving talks about it. maybe that's just part of it. All right, we don't know what we mean by God anymore, and let's keep talking about it. But I'm not special in that. I'm not like, ooh, I don't know what I mean by God anymore. I say we don't know what we mean because God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And who will wipe the blood from our hands? And it's, in other words, I think it's part of the era that we're in. And to make it broad, it's part of the life-death life cycle that we're in. Our most sacred images that we've held up as a culture are being called into question, are being robbed of their power. And we're starting to see the illusions and the projections that we've placed upon the divine and upon God and upon our institutions and upon our leaders, when we've seen them to be just how horrifyingly human they are. Political leaders and religious leaders, just horrifyingly human. And it's like, man, what is happening? What's happening to in the world right now? And what I'm saying is that this is part of the real death. This is the death of the ego, of the way things are, and the way things are, the way we've wanted them to be. And it's something like this. I think we cannot help as we grow up. I don't care what kind of environment you were brought up in, religious or non-religious. Something builds up around the word and the image God. Whether you say, I don't believe in God, or whether you say, I do believe in God and he's a male and he's my father and he's, and you start, adding to the layers here. But what seems to happen, and I almost think this is, again, just the way it is that something of an idol forms over time. It's not God. If you take the Buddhist phrase, it's a finger pointing to the moon, but we take the finger and we confuse that with God, and we say, there's God, and now I know who God is and how God operates and what God's will is, and so forth and so on. And over time, this becomes an idol, and we're not bowing down to the mystery; we're bowing down to the idol. And just like in the Exodus story, Moses comes down the mountain and is horrified that the Jewish people they're really called Hebrews here at this point, are worshiping an idol. So he smashes it, grinds it to dust, and makes people drink it. That's a death. And that's what's happening now to our ideas and images of God. They're being ground down to dust, and we're being made to drink them. Now, what I would say is that this is part of the transformative process. Yes to this. Yes. And let's see what grows in its wake, because the cycle doesn't end. Life, death, life, renewal, resurrection. We don't know what will grow in its place. We don't know how our own ideas and images and experience of the divine might expand, might grow, just like a tree, in the shade of which maybe only our great-grandchildren will enjoy. But the fact that it's happening, that there's a death happening, we can't do anything about. We can resist it. We can pretend it's not happening. We can plug our ears. We can double down, I suppose, and try to block out the world and circle the wagons and say, well, the one thing that won't happen to me is my ideas of God will not be challenged or changed. And I say, okay, that's fine. You can live that way, but you're going to die that way, and you're not going to go into the ground. You're going to die with your illusions still intact, to your own great loss and to the loss of your children and your community. So, like James Finley says, a student of Thomas Merton, I was in the monastery with Thomas Merton. No idea of God is God. I mean, that ought to be above the sign of every Christian bookstore, if there are any left, in the country. No idea of God is God, or the religion section at Barnes & Noble, religion right underneath. No idea of God as God. Just to hold it loosely, that my ideas need to die. And that's what's happening in part to Jesus here on the cross. You have forsaken me. Well, who is the you here? Who's the God that is doing the forsaking? That God is being ground to dust, and Jesus is drinking it just as he drank the gall offered to him by the soldiers. That bitter taste, and down it goes, and into the ground, and into the tomb, and into the darkness, and we'll see what's born in its place. We'll see what will resurrect in its place. So, what am I saying? I'm saying in stage 7, to really get close to the life-death-life cycle and to let our egos be unraveled, is a kind of grief and a lament and a rage and a you left me and you abandoned me. All of these are quite natural and are part of the process, the terrible process of the grain of wheat going into the ground, which I think brings me to the final image, which is the image of the cross. And maybe it's worth just mentioning a line from St. Bonaventure, who talks about the coincidence of opposites, somehow Jesus embodying or standing amidst the coincidence of opposites. And the coincidence of opposites is an image that expresses that there's a fundamental unity between two poles. That somehow the two opposites overlap in the center, and there's a fundamental unity and a point of connection between what appears to be polar opposites. And the cross is an image like that. It's the coincidence of opposites. It's Jesus being crucified between the underworld and the upper world, between the darkness of the underworld and Hades and the shadows and the upper world, the world of light and spirit, and like a dove descending and the heavens being torn open. It's between those. It's neither one or the other, it's both. And Jesus is fixed on the ground on a tree. You know, that's really what a cross was a tree. And actually some of them were just actual trees that the Romans used to pin people up onto. And that image too is it's that beautiful upper world, underworld, and the connection between the two. And here Jesus is being crucified between the coincidence of opposites. And same with kind of the right and left poles here. He's between two thieves, which is interesting in and of itself. And one seems to embody a believing self, and the other seems to embody the skeptic. And it's not saying one or the other, it's saying both. We too, to really pass through the kind of death I'm describing, is to maintain the tension of both existing. The skeptic, you're nothing but a thief and there is no God. And the believer that says something like, and in spite of that, there's something mysterious and beautiful and true and divine about what's happening, and I believe. So it's like that. Jesus goes to heal someone, and the man says, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." I always loved that. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. That's the coincidence of opposites, and in a way, that's the kind of transformative faith that takes us into the ground, that takes us into our own transformative process, the life, death, life cycle. Neither fully embracing one and rejecting the other, or I should say, that's often what it feels like. That's the temptation. That's what politics are forcing us into, and same with religion right now. Pick a side. But instead, we're crucified between two thieves, the believer and the non-believer. We're between light and shadow, between day and night. And in the midst of all this, something like a sword is run straight through our heart, like the Christ here, where blood and water flows out. We're crucified in the midst of paradox, is what the life, death, life cycle and the cross seem to be suggesting here. So what am I saying? I'm saying that the image of the cross asks us to stretch our arms out like this as well, to all that's unresolved in our lives, to be splayed out by reality itself, both with prayers of desperation, you have forsaken me, and prayers of belief, both. And to live like this is to allow the mystery to do mystery's work. And what the life, death, life cycle is saying here, and what the symbol is saying, the Christ symbol, is that resurrection will come. And we won't exactly know how. I mean, it's funny because the disciples don't recognize it. The first person that Jesus appears to is Mary Magdalene, which tells you how intimate their relationship was. And but nobody could really see it coming, which I think in and of itself suggests we don't know what will come in its place. All we know is that this is how the evolution of consciousness works. We die and we are reborn. And in the process of doing so, it comes to us as kind of a surprise. I don't know how I ended up like this. Even the fact, I mean, here's a very mini sort of death and resurrection story. I thought as I was exiting evangelical Christianity, I would be done with talking about Jesus. I'd be done talking about the Bible. I'm putting all these things away. And I sold all of my books all in one shot that were related to this kind of stuff. And somebody bought them on the internet, the whole library. And I wasn't trying to cling to this or that. It just seemed like that was the right thing to do. Let the whole thing go, and we'll see what happens. I probably wasn't even thinking that at the time, but just it was more of the invitation of let it go. And the fact that I'm talking about it now on an audiobook, and it still has resonance and power, means in a very small way, something like a death and resurrection has happened with my own relationship to the Christ symbol and my own relationship to the biblical text that I could never have predicted and I couldn't have manufactured. It just happened the way it happened. It went into the ground. I even did a whole burial ceremony around my role as a pastor. I did a couple different ceremonies, but one of them was a burial ceremony, and taking bits and pieces and images from the life that was meaningful to me and had shaped me and had given me a sense of identity and putting it in the ground. Yep. And that is not a triumphant thing. It's not like, haha, how lame was I back when I was, it's actually much, much more like a funeral process where there's a little grief and some funny stories and you try to let it go. That's how it felt to me, at least. So the question here emerging, I think, is how wide open do you want to live to the world? As wide open as the arms of Christ, who seems to face even the horrors of life itself with open arms. Choosing love, choosing to fully embody what it means to be the son of humanity here. And to let the world have its way and to meet that with courage at the same time. So it's not a giving up, it's actually a facing up, but with a kind of open vulnerability. Seems to be at the core of the life, death, life stage here. So that brings me to some questions here. And maybe these are questions for the final stage here, but maybe they're just questions about that encapsulate all 7 stages of a life transformed. Question number 1 is a line from Mary Oliver. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? What will you do with your one wild and precious life? The clock is ticking. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? Question number 2. Is it time to clearly as you can, state your desires and longings? I mean, many people just live with them half buried. And you don't see that with the Christ figure here, especially in the garden. Let it out. I don't want to drink this cup. This is not the cup I signed up for. So is it time that you really, honestly stated those desires to yourself, to the world, to God, to nature, and to let them go at the same time? To toy with and contemplate and ponder, not my will but yours. Is there a larger mystery at work? See, that's the beginning of just embracing the paradox that is the human condition. Here's question number 3. Do you need to have some words with God? I really see that this final stage here, part of it is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so many people hold back from that. And what we can say is that Jesus did it. I mean, do you need to lay it out? Because in order to get close to the possibility that you might be carrying illusions and idols around your notions of the divine, you got to let it out. You got to state your case. You have to state whether or not you feel abandoned or overwhelmed or forgotten or misled or mistreated, or you fill in the blank. I mean, if you can say anything, I mean, if God is real, and whatever that means, I think God can take it. If he can take it from Jesus, he can take it from you. So I'm basically giving you permission and asking you a question. Do you need to have some words around the divine? To spell it out. And then to be open to the fact that you might be carrying your own projections, illusions, and ultimately a kind of idol. Here's question number 4. Maybe you're being asked to die authentically between 2 worlds. And I'm saying this because, like I said before, the entire culture is screaming about everything, choose a side. And ultimately behind that is a kind of good-evil dynamic. And the story might be suggesting something like maybe you're being asked to die authentically between 2 worlds, even between 2 thieves of your own psyche, the believer and the non-believer, the good and the evil, the good boy and the bad boy, the good girl and the bad girl. These are the paradoxes of and the complexities of our own psyche, and to live that wide open, to allow both to say, yes, I'm that complicated, and so might the world, instead of constantly dividing everything up. And that can feel a bit like a crucifixion, like something is happening unto you. Number 5. And this is maybe a question that is real simple. It's related to what I've been trying to say the last few hours. What image or images resonate with you? I mean, of all the stages and images and passages and words and pictures that came out of that, what resonated with you? And what would it look like to take it seriously? To draw it, to contemplate it, to imagine it, to talk about it, to turn it over, to allow it to work on you, to carry it with you. Say, what? Maybe there's something more here than I ever imagined, and to carry it, to put it in your pouch and carry it out into the world, to let it do its work on you. Because in a pill popping culture, we want a pill for everything, and we want an answer for everything, and we want facts, and that's not the way transformative images work. They knock on the door. Like Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears me and lets me in, I'll come inside and dwell there. And it's like tap, 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 tap. And that's what resonated with you? You could even start with what really bothered you and get real curious about that. Well, why did it bother me? Because that's also what I mean by resonate. I don't just mean things that made you happy, but maybe even just bothered you a bit. Well, what would it look like to put that in your pouch and carry that around with you for a while and let it do its work? Let it do its work, because archetypal symbols have no bottom, and they scratch the surface, and they want to pull us down into the underworld of our own experience here. And here's my final question that I can't answer, and I have no intention of answering, but I am suggesting it's worth wrestling with, and it's really very simple. What is the next small step you can take toward a life of meaning and depth? What is the next small step toward a life of meaning and depth? What is that next small step? And I guess I want to encourage you to take it. Peace, love, grace, compassion, paradox, meaning. I wish all of these things upon you. I love you all. Thank you so much for supporting me, for supporting my podcast. To my Patreon supporters, you made this audiobook happen, and I hope you heard somewhere in here a hint, a clue, a guess that is just the right kind of hint and clue and guess for this time in your life. Peace.